When Ninja Assassin arrived in theaters in the final weeks of November 2009, it carried an odd pedigree that promised more than the finished film ultimately delivered on in critical terms, even as it fulfilled its promise commercially and, more lastingly, as a cult object. The project sat at the intersection of several converging creative currents: the action genre instincts of James McTeigue, a director who had cut his teeth as an assistant director on the Wachowskis' Matrix trilogy before graduating to helm V for Vendetta, the world-building sensibilities of the Wachowskis themselves, who produced the film and clearly saw in its premise an opportunity to extend their fascination with hidden orders, secret societies, and stylized violence into a new genre space. And the pulpy, hard-boiled instincts of Joel Silver, a producer whose career-long affinity for genre spectacle, from the Die Hard franchise to Lethal Weapon, gave the production its commercial backbone. This combination of pedigrees is worth dwelling on, because it explains much about the film's peculiar tonal register. Ninja Assassin is simultaneously trying to be a myth-laden origin story in the vein of The Matrix, with its orphan chosen one protagonist and its secret clan mythology, and a lean, brutal exploitation picture indebted to Silver's decades of experience turning hard violence into box office returns. The screenplay, credited to Matthew Sand and J. Michael Straczynski, reflects this duality as well. Straczynski, best known to genre audiences as the creator of the science fiction television series Babylon 5, brought to the project a sensibility attuned to serialized mythology and layered backstory, which is visible in the film's insistence on returning again and again to Reizo's childhood, using flashback not merely as exposition but as a structuring device that runs parallel to and comments upon the present tense action. Sand's contributions, meanwhile, seem more attuned to the mechanics of the assassination thriller, the plotting of double-crosses, safe houses, and institutional corruption that gives the film's European-set present-day sequences their shape. The resulting screenplay is less a seamless whole than a collision of two different genre engines, one operating in the realm of myth and origin, the other in the realm of the contemporary conspiracy thriller, and much of what makes Ninja Assassin an interesting object of study, if not always a fully successful film, stems from how visibly these two engines grind against each other. The film's production banners are equally telling. Legendary Pictures, Dark Castle Entertainment, and Silver Pictures together suggest a project engineered from the outset as a mid-budget genre vehicle with crossover appeal, rather than as an attempt at either high-art martial arts cinema or knowing pastiche. Dark Castle in particular had built its identity on stylish, R-rated horror and thriller properties, and that DNA is evident in the extremity of Ninja Assassin's violence, which pushes well past what mainstream action cinema of the period typically allowed. Distribution by Warner Bros. Placed the film within the orbit of a major studio's marketing muscle, ensuring it would receive a wide theatrical release even as its content skewed toward the kind of hard-R spectacle more commonly associated with smaller genre labels. Raizo and the Shape of the Ninja Body. At the center of the film is Rain, the South Korean singer and actor whose casting as Raizo represented a calculated bet on crossover stardom. Rain had already achieved significant fame across Asia as a pop performer, and his casting here follows a familiar Hollywood pattern of importing international star power to anchor a genre film aimed at a global audience. What is notable about his performance, though, is how thoroughly the film subordinates conventional dramatic expressiveness to physical presence. Raizo speaks sparingly throughout the film, and much of what the character communicates is rendered through posture, stillness, and the controlled explosiveness of his fight choreography rather than through dialogue or facial performance. This is, in a sense, an old strategy of martial arts cinema, where the body itself becomes the primary vehicle of characterization, legible through the precision, brutality, or grace of its movement rather than through psychological interiority expressed in words. Rain's physical training for the role, the visible discipline in his fight sequences, aligns him with this tradition even as the film surrounds him with a very different, more Western, thriller apparatus of double agents and institutional betrayal. Opposite him, Sho Kosugi's casting as Lord Ozunu carries a weight that a viewer unfamiliar with the martial arts film canon of the 1980s might miss entirely, but which functions almost as a form of genre citation for those who recognize it. Kosugi was, in the previous generation of American martial arts cinema, virtually synonymous with ninja mythology on screen, having starred in a string of films that helped popularize the ninja as a stock figure of American genre cinema. His presence in Ninja Assassin, cast now as the villainous patriarch rather than the young hero, functions as a kind of passing of the torch, an acknowledgement that the film understands itself as inheriting and modernizing a lineage of ninja cinema that Kosugi himself helped establish decades earlier. There is something almost ceremonial about seeing him in the role of the corrupting father figure, the source of the violence that the young generation must overcome, as though the film is staging its own relationship to genre history within its plot. The supporting cast pulls the film in yet another direction. Naomie Harris, playing Europol agent Mika Coretti, and Ben Miles as her superior Ryan Marslow anchor the film's procedural, present-day plotline, giving it the texture of a European conspiracy thriller, all secret files, institutional distrust, and bureaucratic betrayal. Rick Yune, as Tokishi, Kiriko's elder brother and the executioner who kills her, provides the film with its most personally motivated antagonist within the clan structure, a character whose actions are driven not by abstract loyalty to Lord Ozunu but by his direct role in the tragedy that defines Raizo's arc. This mixture of a Korean pop star, a veteran of classic American ninja cinema, and a roster of British and international actors playing European law enforcement officials gives the film a genuinely international texture, one that mirrors its narrative interest in a secret organization whose reach and clientele span the globe. Childhood as Trauma Factory, the Ozunu Clan's pedagogy of violence. The film's flashback structure, which recurs throughout to chart Raizo's childhood within the Ozunu Clan, deserves close attention because it is here that the film makes its most ambitious, if not always its most graceful, attempt to give psychological weight to what might otherwise be a simple string of action set pieces. The Ozunu Clan is depicted as an operation that recruits orphan children from around the world and subjects them to a training regimen explicitly coded as brutal, even abusive, transforming them into assassins available for hire to wealthy clients at a steep price. This premise does important structural work, by making the clan a commercial enterprise, charging a fixed, almost absurdly formalized price for its killings. The film frames the ninja not as a figure of noble martial tradition but as a product of institutionalized exploitation, a human being manufactured for profit through the deliberate infliction of suffering. The specificity of the pricing detail, the fixed sum in gold demanded for a contract killing, has a strange effect of grounding the mythic material in something closer to organized crime logic, suggesting that beneath the film's supernatural-tinged displays of shadow manipulation and inhuman resilience lies a fundamentally mercenary, transactional world. Raizo's position within this system is doubly burdened, since the film establishes him not merely as one orphan among many but as the heir apparent to Lord Ozunu himself, the chosen successor whose training is consequently even more punishing than that of his peers. This detail matters because it recontextualizes the entire childhood section of the film as a story about inherited violence, about a son groomed to replace and eventually become his abusive father, a dynamic that gives the eventual confrontation between Raizo and Ozunu a psychological dimension beyond simple good versus evil action movie plotting. The film is, in this sense, engaging with a very old narrative structure, the story of the son who must kill the father to escape becoming him, though it renders this structure through the aesthetic vocabulary of contemporary ultraviolent action cinema rather than through the more restrained registers in which such stories are often told. Into this bleak landscape the film introduces its one note of tenderness, Kiriko, a young kunoichi, or female ninja, whose relationship with Raizo constitutes the emotional armature for everything that follows. The film is careful to frame this relationship as the sole source of warmth in an otherwise dehumanizing environment, the single crack of light in the Ozunu Clan system of manufactured cruelty. Their bond is depicted as developing specifically because it stands in opposition to everything the clan demands of them, an assertion of individual human feeling within a system designed to eradicate it. This is why Kiriko's arc of growing disillusionment carries such narrative weight. Her decision to flee the clan represents not just a personal choice but a rejection of the entire logic of the Ozunu's pedagogy, an assertion that the humanity trained out of these children can, in fact, reassert itself. The film's staging of Kiriko's escape attempt, climbing a wall on a rainy night while urging Raizo to join her, and his refusal to do so, is the pivotal trauma of the entire narrative, the wound around which the rest of the story organizes itself. Raizo's choice to stay, whatever mixture of fear, indoctrination, or hope that his own eventual escape or reform might be possible motivated it, becomes the source of an unresolvable guilt once Kiriko is captured and, in one of the film's most brutal sequences, executed in front of him by Tokishi, her own elder brother, who impales her through the heart. The detail that her executioner is her own brother intensifies the sense that the clan has succeeded in converting even family bonds into instruments of its violence, that everyone within this system, given long enough exposure to its training, becomes capable of killing those they should protect. Forcing Raizo to witness this killing is the film's clearest articulation of trauma as an engineered pedagogical tool. The Ozunu Clan does not merely train bodies to fight, it deliberately manufactures psychological wounds in its recruits, using loss and horror as instruments to bind its assassins more completely to the organization, or, in Raizo's case, inadvertently planting the seed of the very rebellion it sought to prevent. Berlin, betrayal, and the fracture of the clan. The film's transition into its adult Raizo narrative is marked by his first assassination assignment, a mission against a group of gangsters that the film uses to establish, in a compressed and brutal fashion, the level of lethal competence Raizo has attained through his training. This sequence functions largely as a demonstration piece, an opportunity to display the choreography and visual style that will define the film's combat sequences going forward, heavy on practical effects blended with digital blood work, favoring rapid, decisive killing strokes over the more balletic, extended fight choreography associated with classical martial arts cinema. It is worth noting that the film's fight aesthetic draws more from the Wachowskis' interest in kinetic, almost operatic violence, familiar from their work on The Matrix, than from the disciplined, form-focused choreography of traditional wuxia or classical ninja films. The result is a style that favors overwhelming, often gruesomely excessive violence, characters dispatched not with single clean strikes but through sustained assaults that leave the frame awash in exaggerated quantities of blood, a stylistic choice that drew significant comment, much of it critical, upon the film's release. The Berlin skyscraper sequence that follows the gangster assassination represents the film's central rupture, the moment at which Reizo's accumulated guilt over Kiriko's death finally erupts into open rebellion against Lord Ozunu. The staging is significant. Lord Ozunu commands Raizo to execute a captured kunoichi who has, like Kiriko once did, betrayed the clan, and it is this direct echo of the earlier trauma, being asked to become the instrument of exactly the kind of punishment that destroyed the person he loved, that finally breaks Reizo's compliance. His attack on Lord Ozunu, slashing his mentor's face with the Kyoketsu Shoge, a distinctive weapon combining a curved blade with a length of chain and a weighted ring, is staged as a moment of both violent liberation and irrevocable exile. In attacking his father figure, Raizo simultaneously frees himself from and severs himself entirely from the only family structure, however monstrous, that he has ever known. His subsequent battle against his fellow ninjas atop the skyscraper, and his near-fatal fall into the river below, complete the sequence's function as a symbolic death and rebirth, Raizo quite literally plunging from the heights of the clan's world into the anonymity of the water below, from which he must construct an entirely new existence. The years of solitary recovery and self-directed training that follow are handled with relative economy by the film, functioning primarily as a narrative bridge that explains both Reizo's survival and his subsequent decision to dedicate himself to sabotaging the very organization that raised him. This choice, to become a saboteur working specifically against Ozunu assassination contracts rather than simply disappearing to live a quiet, anonymous life, is significant because it reframes Reizo's arc away from simple survival and toward something closer to atonement, an attempt to prevent the deaths of others as a kind of penance for his failure to save Kiriko, and by extension for his years of complicity within a murderous organization. This detail gives the film's action plotting, which might otherwise read as an arbitrary string of confrontations, a clearer emotional through-line. Each assassination Raizo disrupts is simultaneously an act of practical resistance against Ozunu and a symbolic repetition of the moment he failed to act on Kiriko's behalf, this time with the outcome reversed. Mika Coretti and the machinery of institutional distrust. The introduction of Mika Coretti, the Europol agent whose independent investigation into a string of politically motivated assassinations eventually intersects with Reizo's private war against the Ozunu, brings the film's second major generic register fully into play, the conspiracy thriller, with its bureaucratic secrecy, institutional betrayal, and the lone investigator whose diligence uncovers truths her superiors would rather remain buried. Mika's arc, defying her superior Ryan Maslow to retrieve classified files connecting a string of murders to a hidden organization, follows a well-worn template of the genre, but its integration with Reizo's ninja mythology plotline gives the film an unusual hybrid structure, one in which ancient, almost supernatural assassin lore collides with the mundane, procedural machinery of international law enforcement. The relationship between Mika and Raizo, once established, becomes the film's vehicle for exploring themes of trust and its violation across radically different institutional contexts. Mika's decision to convince Raizo to seek protection from Maslow, only for Raizo to be immediately arrested and interrogated rather than protected, replays in an institutional register the same betrayal dynamic that structures Reizo's own backstory. An authority figure who is supposed to offer protection instead exploits vulnerability for its own purposes. That Maslow later reassures Mika of his continued loyalty, providing her with a tracking device for emergencies even after this apparent betrayal, keeps the film's moral landscape genuinely ambiguous for a stretch, refusing to resolve cleanly into simple categories of trustworthy ally and treacherous enemy. This ambiguity is one of the more effective elements of the film's screenplay, lending at least a degree of tension to sequences that might otherwise function purely as connective tissue between action set pieces. The subsequent siege of the Europol safe house by Ozunu ninjas, an infiltration explicitly designed to eliminate both Raizo and anyone who might have learned from him, escalates the stakes considerably by demonstrating the clan's reach and ruthlessness extend well beyond the confines of its own hidden compound into the heart of a supposedly secure international law enforcement facility. This sequence functions as the film's clearest demonstration that Ozunu's power is not merely mythic but operationally formidable, capable of penetrating institutions that a contemporary audience would reasonably expect to be secure. Mika's role in freeing Raizo during this assault, and her subsequent decision to hide him and nurse his near-fatal wounds in a motel room, cements her transformation from investigator into active participant in Raizo's war, a transition the film marks physically through her act of implanting a tracking device into his body, a moment layered with a kind of intimate vulnerability that contrasts sharply with the film's otherwise unrelenting violence. The mountain retreat and the aesthetics of illuminated violence. The film's climactic assault on the Ozunu retreat, staged in a secluded mountain compound that serves as the clan's spiritual and operational headquarters, brings together every narrative thread the film has been developing: Reizo's personal vendetta against Lord Ozunu and Tokishi, Mika, and Maslow's institutional effort to dismantle the organization through overwhelming force, and the underlying thematic concern with breaking cycles of inherited violence. The specific tactical detail the film employs here, the use of powerful flares to turn night into day above the retreat, is worth dwelling on as more than mere action sequence mechanics. By flooding the traditionally shadow-dependent domain of the ninja with artificial daylight, the assault sequence stages a literal confrontation between the technological power of a modern institutional force and the shadow-based mysticism upon which the Ozunu clan's entire identity and combat method depends. The ninja, whose power has always been coded through stealth, concealment, and the manipulation of darkness, is here stripped of his native element by industrial-scale illumination, a visual and tactical metaphor for the way institutional, technologically equipped modernity threatens to overwhelm and neutralize older, more mythic modes of violence. It is within this stripped, exposed environment that Reizo's confrontations with Tokishi and ultimately Lord Ozunu play out. His killing of Tokishi closes out the specific thread of vengeance tied to Kiriko's execution, addressing directly the person whose hand delivered the fatal blow, while the subsequent duel with Lord Ozunu escalates into the film's central confrontation between the son and the father figure who made him what he is. Mika's intervention in this duel, and her subsequent stabbing at Lord Ozunu's hands, momentarily threatens to undercut Reizo's victory with a devastating personal loss, mirroring, whether intentionally or not, the earlier pattern in which those closest to Raizo are punished for their proximity to him. That the film ultimately reveals Mika's survival to be the result of an anatomical anomaly, her heart situated on the right side of her chest rather than the left, is among the more conspicuously convenient plot devices in the screenplay, a deus ex machina that allows the film to have its emotional cake, a near-fatal wound suffered on Reizo's behalf, and eat it too, no lasting consequence to the character. Whatever one makes of the device's plausibility, its narrative function is clear. It permits the film to conclude on a note of triumph rather than tragedy, denying Raizo the additional trauma of losing yet another person who mattered to him. Reizo's final confrontation with Lord Ozunu introduces the film's most explicitly supernatural flourish, the shadow blending technique that Raizo deploys for the first time in the narrative, using it to disorient and ultimately kill his former mentor. This technique, essentially a form of camouflage that allows Raizo to become invisible against dark backgrounds, functions on a symbolic level as the culmination of everything the character has learned and, more importantly, has transcended, having spent the entire film emerging from shadow, from concealment, from the hidden trauma of his childhood, into visibility and selfhood. His final act of violence against the man who created him is achieved precisely through mastery of the shadow itself, suggesting that Reizo's ultimate triumph lies not in rejecting the ninja's traditional tools but in claiming complete ownership over them, using the clan's own methods to end the clan's reign rather than needing to step outside that tradition entirely. The Wall, revisited, an ending of earned solitude. The film's closing image, Raizo climbing the same wall Kiriko once climbed in her failed bid for freedom, and this time reaching the top to look out over the surrounding countryside with an expression the film reads as genuine, unguarded happiness, functions as the narrative's clearest statement of thematic closure. The repetition of this specific physical action, the wall climbing that once ended in Kiriko's capture and eventual execution, transforms what was originally a site of trauma into a site of achieved liberation. Raizo succeeds, 20 years and immeasurable violence later, in completing the exact gesture his lost love was never permitted to complete, a rhyme that gives the film's final moments a sense of earned emotional payoff that the preceding 2 hours of brutal combat might not, on their own, have seemed to be building toward. It is worth noting how spare this ending is in terms of conventional genre payoff. Rather than closing on a note of romantic union with Mika, or a triumphant return to society, or the promise of a sequel-ready expanded conflict, the film chooses to end with Raizo essentially alone, in the ruins of the organization that made and nearly destroyed him, experiencing something the film frames as freedom for the first time in his life. This choice aligns Ninja Assassin more closely with tragic or melancholic strains of genre storytelling than with the triumphant, forward-looking endings typical of contemporary action blockbusters. Raizo's freedom is not depicted as the beginning of a new chapter of adventure but as a kind of stillness, an internal resolution achieved at the cost of everything and everyone he once knew, Kiriko above all. The film's insistence on ending here, on this quiet, solitary note rather than on spectacle, suggests that beneath its extravagant violence, Ninja Assassin understood itself, at least in its conception, as fundamentally a story about the long, costly process of escaping an abusive inheritance, with the action sequences functioning as externalized expressions of an internal struggle for selfhood rather than as ends in themselves. The film's critical reception upon release skewed heavily negative, with many reviewers taking issue with what was widely perceived as an over-reliance on graphic violence at the expense of narrative coherence or character development. This criticism is not without merit. The screenplay's dual generic ambitions, mythic origin story and institutional conspiracy thriller, do not always integrate smoothly, and the film's pacing sometimes suffers from the effort to service both registers simultaneously. Yet it is also worth situating this critical reception within a broader context of how genre cinema focused on extreme, stylized violence has often been received by mainstream critical establishments, which have historically shown limited patience for films that prioritize visceral spectacle over psychological or narrative subtlety, regardless of whatever thematic ambitions might underlie that spectacle. Ninja Assassin's violence is, by design, excessive to the point of near abstraction in places, blood rendered in quantities that exceed any plausible physiological reality, a stylistic choice clearly intended to evoke a kind of operatic, almost comic book intensity rather than grounded realism. Critics inclined to judge the film by standards of restraint or realism were always likely to find it wanting, while audiences and subsequent cult reappraisal have often been more receptive to reading this excess as a deliberate aesthetic strategy rather than a failure of discipline. Commercially, the film performed moderately well, recouping its budget and turning a profit despite the lukewarm to hostile critical reception, a pattern common to genre films whose appeal is driven less by critical consensus than by a built-in audience for stylized action and Rain's international star draw. This commercial performance is itself instructive. It demonstrates that Ninja Assassin successfully identified and served an audience whose interest in the ninja mythology, in stylized ultraviolence, and in the specific hybrid of martial arts spectacle and Wachowski-inflected visual sensibility was sufficient to sustain a profitable theatrical run even in the face of critical dismissal. Legacy and genre context. Viewed within the broader landscape of ninja cinema, Ninja Assassin occupies an interesting transitional position. It arrives decades after the initial American boom in ninja films that Sho Kosugi himself helped drive in the 1980s, and it consciously gestures back toward that earlier era through Kosugi's casting, even as it attempts to modernize the ninja narrative through contemporary digital effects, a globalized cast, and a plot structure borrowing heavily from the conspiracy thriller genre rather than the more straightforward action-adventure plotting typical of earlier ninja films. In this sense, the film functions as something of a bridge text, an attempt to translate a genre icon rooted in a specific earlier moment of American genre cinema into the visual and narrative idioms of the late 2000s, incorporating the kinetic, hyper-stylized violence that the Wachowskis had helped popularize through The Matrix and its imitators. Whether or not Ninja Assassin fully succeeds in reconciling its component parts, mythic origin story, institutional thriller, and stylized violence, its ambition to do so, and the specific creative lineage it draws upon, from Straczynski's serialized myth-making instincts to Silver's genre picture pragmatism to the Wachowskis' fascination with hidden, shadow-governed worlds, make it a richer object of study than its critical reception at the time might suggest. The film's engagement with themes of inherited trauma, institutional betrayal, and the difficult, costly process of breaking free from an abusive system that has shaped one's entire identity gives its action sequences, however excessive, a thematic scaffolding that elevates the material beyond simple spectacle, even if the execution does not always fully realize the ambition. It remains, ultimately, a film best appreciated on its own hybrid terms, as a piece of myth-inflected genre cinema whose interest in the psychology of manufactured violence and its costs runs, sometimes uneasily, alongside its evident enthusiasm for delivering that violence in the most visually extravagant terms possible. A cast list, at first glance, seems like the least interpretively rich part of any film's paratextual material, a bureaucratic ledger of names and roles rather than a site of meaning. But the Ninja Assassin roster, examined with any patience, turns out to be a remarkably dense record of the specific industrial and geographic conditions under which the film was made, as well as a kind of accidental time capsule that captures several careers at pivotal, formative moments, long before some of the names on this list would become far more widely recognized than they were in 2009. To read through the credits of Ninja Assassin is to read a document that reveals, almost inadvertently, the film's production geography, a Berlin-based shoot staffed heavily with German character actors and stunt performers, its casting logic, a lead built out of layered, age-doubled performances, and its place within a broader network of stunt professionals and character actors whose later trajectories would intersect with the action genre in ways that retroactively illuminate what kind of film this was trying to be. This examination proceeds role by role, but always with an eye toward what each casting choice, however small, tells us about the film's ambitions, its production circumstances, and its place in a wider cinematic ecosystem. Rain and the architecture of a layered protagonist. The decision to split the role of Raizo across three performers, Rain as the adult assassin, Sungwon Yoon as the young child undergoing the Ozunu Clan's earliest and most brutalizing training, and Lee Jun as the teenage Raizo navigating adolescence within the clan, is a structural choice with consequences well beyond simple logistical necessity. Any film that spans a character's life from childhood to adulthood faces the basic problem of continuity, since no single actor can plausibly embody both a small child and a grown adult, but the specific way Ninja Assassin handles this problem is worth dwelling on. Rather than using a single continuous flashback strategy narrated in voiceover, or relying on makeup and prosthetics to stretch a single actor across decades, the film commits to three distinct, fully embodied performances, effectively building Raizo as a character who exists in triplicate, each version specific to its own developmental stage and its own register of trauma. Rain's casting as the adult Raizo represented, as noted in relation to the plot itself, a calculated bet on international crossover appeal, drawing on his considerable fame as a musical performer across Asia to anchor a film aimed at global audiences. But it is worth considering what his performance style specifically brought to the role beyond marquee value. Rain's background as a dancer and performer gave him a body attuned to precision and control, qualities that translate directly into the visual language of a martial arts film built around disciplined, almost balletic violence punctuated by explosive brutality. His casting reflects a broader pattern in genre cinema of the period, in which studios increasingly looked toward musical and idol performers from South Korea and elsewhere in Asia as vehicles for crossover stardom, recognizing that the physical discipline required of professional dancers and performers often maps naturally onto the demands of action choreography. Sungwon Yoon's role as the young Raizo, though brief in screen time relative to Rain's, carries an outsized thematic burden, since it is here that the film establishes the foundational cruelty of the Ozunu Clan's training regimen, the abuse that will define everything Raizo does as an adult. Casting a child actor in a role that requires depicting, even through the necessarily restrained lens of a wide-release studio film, the brutalization of a young orphan is a delicate undertaking, and the fact that this performance had to communicate suffering, resilience, and the earliest stirrings of the emotional bond with Kiriko without the benefit of extensive dialogue or interiority speaks to how much weight the film places on physical and expressive performance even in its youngest actors. Lee Jun, taking on the character in his teenage years, occupies the crucial transitional space in which Reizo's relationship with Kiriko deepens into genuine romantic attachment and in which the specific trauma of her wall-climbing escape attempt and execution occurs. This is arguably the most emotionally demanding segment of Reizo's arc, since it requires conveying both the deepening of an adolescent bond and its catastrophic severing, and the choice to cast a distinct actor for this age range, rather than asking Rain to play noticeably younger, underscores the film's overall commitment to precision in its handling of the character's chronology. This tripartite structure, when considered as a whole, suggests that Ninja Assassin understood its protagonist's backstory not as mere connective exposition to be dispatched efficiently, but as a load-bearing element of the narrative deserving of the same performative investment as the present-day action sequences. 3 actors, 3 ages, 3 registers of suffering and connection, assembled into a single continuous character. This is a surprisingly ambitious structural commitment for a genre film sometimes dismissed by critics as prioritizing spectacle over character work. Anna Sawai, Kylie Leah Goldstein, and the weight of a single relationship. If Reizo's tripartite construction reflects the film's investment in his psychological through-line, the doubling of Kiriko across Anna Sawai and Kylie Leah Goldstein performs a parallel function for the character whose loss defines the entire narrative's emotional stakes. It is worth pausing on the specific historical position this casting occupies. Anna Sawai, at the time of Ninja Assassin's production, was a young actress near the beginning of her career, and her casting here as Kiriko predates by well over a decade the international prominence she would achieve through prestige television work that transformed her into one of the most acclaimed performers of her generation. Watching, or even simply considering, her presence in this film today carries a kind of retrospective charge that the film's original audiences could not have experienced. A viewer encountering Ninja Assassin now, aware of Sawai's subsequent career trajectory, inevitably reads her performance here through the lens of everything that followed, seeing in this early genre role the first visible traces of a talent that would later receive far more prestigious vehicles for its expression. Kylie Leah Goldstein's brief appearance as the young Kiriko performs essential work in establishing the character before the audience ever encounters her as a young woman capable of romantic feeling and eventual rebellion. The film needs its audience to understand, even in the compressed screen time available to a child performer in a supporting flashback role, that Kiriko's later disillusionment with the clan's brutality is not a sudden late development but the natural outgrowth of a sensitivity and warmth visible even in her earliest scenes. The quality that first draws young Raizo to her amid the otherwise dehumanizing environment of the Ozunu Clan's training compound. The economy with which a child performer must convey this seed of future rebellion, in what is necessarily limited screen time, places real demands on both the young actress and the direction guiding her performance. The Kiriko role, taken as a whole across both performers, is structurally the film's emotional center of gravity despite its relatively limited screen time compared to Reizo's. Every major turn in the adult narrative, Reizo's rebellion against Lord Ozunu, his years of solitary training and sabotage, his ultimate confrontation with Tokishi and Lord Ozunu, and even his climactic wall climbing in the film's final image, is staged as a response to or a fulfillment of what Kiriko represented and lost. This means that the casting and performance of Kiriko across two actresses carries a narrative weight disproportionate to her total minutes on screen, and the film's decision to invest in two distinct, fully realized performances for a character functioning primarily as the emotional catalyst for another character's arc reflects a recognition that this catalytic function only works if the audience genuinely believes in and mourns the relationship being destroyed. Naomie Harris and Ben Miles, the institutional countermelody. Naomie Harris's casting as Mika Coretti brought to the production an actress whose career, by 2009, already included significant credits in both British prestige cinema and international blockbuster franchises, giving the film's European institutional subplot a degree of dramatic credibility that helped ground its more procedural, conspiracy thriller elements against the mythic register of the Ozunu Clan material. Harris's performance as an investigator whose diligence and moral conviction repeatedly put her at odds with her own institution's caution and secrecy gives the film's Europol scenes a texture of genuine ethical stakes, a character whose arc, while secondary to Reizo's, nonetheless follows its own coherent trajectory from institutional compliance to active, personally risky rebellion against her superior's caution. Ben Miles, playing Ryan Marslow, Mika's superior within Europol, occupies one of the screenplay's more carefully calibrated roles in terms of moral ambiguity. As discussed in relation to the plot itself, Maslow's character oscillates between apparent betrayal, arresting and interrogating Raizo rather than protecting him as Mika had hoped, and apparent continued loyalty, reassuring Mika of his support and equipping her with resources to protect Raizo during the safe house assault. Miles's performance needed to sustain this ambiguity convincingly enough that audiences would not immediately categorize Marslow as either a straightforward ally or a straightforward antagonist, preserving genuine uncertainty about his ultimate allegiances until the narrative resolves the question. This is a more demanding assignment than it might initially appear, since institutional thriller antagonists or ambiguous authority figures can easily tip into caricature, either too obviously untrustworthy from the outset or too reassuringly benevolent to generate real tension. Together, Harris and Miles anchor what amounts to the film's second genre engine, the European conspiracy thriller plotline that runs parallel to and eventually intersects with Reizo's mythic revenge narrative. Their casting reflects a clear intent to give this half of the film's split generic identity comparable dramatic weight and credibility to the martial arts mythology surrounding Raizo, ensuring that the film's institutional plotline reads as more than mere connective tissue between action sequences. Yune and Sho Kosugi, two registers of antagonism. Rick Yune's casting as Tokishi places within the film an actor whose career had already established him as a recognizable presence in action and thriller cinema, and his performance as the leader of the Ozunu team sent after Raizo, and as Kiriko's own executioner, required navigating a genuinely difficult characterization. Tokishi is simultaneously an instrument of institutional cruelty, carrying out the clan's brutal punishment of his own sister, and, at least implicitly, a product of the very same dehumanizing training regimen that shaped Raizo, someone who has simply traveled further down the path of complete submission to Lord Ozunu's authority. The film does not spend extensive time humanizing Tokishi or exploring his interiority the way it does with Raizo, but the mere fact of his familial relationship to his victim, executing his own sister on their master's orders, gives even his relatively thin characterization an unavoidable charge of horror, a demonstration of just how completely the clan's training can override even the most fundamental human bonds. Sho Kosugi's presence as Lord Ozunu, as touched upon in relation to the broader plot, functions as much as a piece of genre casting commentary as a straightforward villain performance. Kosugi's decades-earlier prominence in American ninja cinema means that his casting here carries a citational weight that a purely dramatic reading of the role would miss. This is an actor who once represented, for American audiences of the 1980s, the heroic possibilities of ninja mythology, now cast as the corrupt patriarchal figure whose exploitation of children constitutes the moral rot at the center of the story. There is a poignancy, whether fully intentional on the filmmaker's part or an emergent effect of the casting choice, in watching a genre icon who once embodied ninja heroism now embody its darkest possible corruption, suggesting perhaps an implicit commentary on how the genre itself has aged and complicated its own founding mythologies over the intervening decades. Kosugi's performance, restrained and authoritative rather than mustache-twirlingly villainous, lends Lord Ozunu a credibility that helps the film's central father-son conflict feel weighted rather than cartoonish. Randall Duck Kim's tattoo master and the economy of the mentor figure. Randall Duck Kim's role as the tattoo master, though limited in the overall context of the film's runtime, exemplifies a recurring function in mythic origin narratives, the peripheral figure whose brief appearance nonetheless carries disproportionate symbolic and world-building weight. Kim, an actor whose career includes memorable appearances in other genre-adjacent films exploring themes of hidden knowledge and chosen destiny, brings to this small role a gravity that helps flesh out the Ozunu clan's internal culture beyond its simple function as a training and assassination operation. The practice of ritual tattooing within ninja and broader East Asian martial traditions carries associations of permanent commitment, of marking the body with signs of identity, achievement, or spiritual significance, and a character specifically devoted to this practice within the clan's structure suggests a dimension of the Ozunu's operation extending beyond pure combat training into something closer to a total, all-encompassing belief system complete with its own rituals of belonging and marking. The relatively minor screen time afforded such a role, set against the thematic importance it carries in fleshing out the clan's internal culture, reflects a common economy in genre filmmaking. Rather than devoting extensive screen time to world-building exposition, a film can accomplish similar work far more efficiently by populating its margins with specific, evocatively named and performed roles that imply a much larger and more detailed world than the screenplay ever has time to fully explore. The tattoo master exists, functionally, to suggest depth and specificity in the Ozunu clan's internal culture that the film's compressed running time could never accommodate through direct exposition alone. Sung Kang's role, credited simply as Hollywood, is a fascinating inclusion for reasons that extend beyond the character's function within Ninja Assassin itself. Kang, by 2009, had already become closely associated with a very different action franchise built around car culture, street racing, and a tightly bonded, multi-ethnic ensemble cast whose chemistry and loyalty to one another became a defining feature of that franchise's appeal. His casting in a nickname-designated supporting role within Ninja Assassin, one clearly meant to evoke a specific personality type through its very name, a swaggering, larger-than-life presence coded by the nickname itself, suggests a piece of intertextual casting that trades, whether deliberately or simply through Kang's established screen persona, on audience familiarity with the type of charismatic ensemble player he had already become known for portraying elsewhere. The specific choice of a nickname rather than a formal character name for this role also reflects a broader convention in genre ensemble casting, where minor but memorable characters are often given evocative monikers, Hollywood, in this case, connoting a specific kind of showmanship or bravado, rather than fully developed backstories, allowing the film to suggest a rich and specific personality through a single descriptive word rather than through extended characterization. The Yakuza Gauntlet, Jonathan Chan Pensley, Il-young Kim, and Yuki Iwamoto. The trio of roles credited as Yakuza Henchman, Yakuza Mohawk, and Yakuza Couch, performed respectively by Jonathan Chan Pensley, Il Young Kim, and Yuki Iwamoto, illustrate a different but equally important function within the cast list: the texture-providing roles that populate a film's early action sequences without requiring extended characterization. These figures belong to the gangster assassination sequence that opens the film's adult Raizo narrative, the mission the film uses to establish, in a compressed and brutal fashion, the level of lethal competence Raizo has developed through his training. The specificity of these credited descriptors, particularly Yakuza Mohawk and Yakuza Couch, a title that implies a very particular staging, presumably a henchman encountered lounging on furniture within whatever criminal establishment the sequence takes place in, gives even these fleeting roles a specificity that helps ground the sequence in a concrete, particularized underworld setting rather than a generic, interchangeable crowd of nameless victims. Genre cinema of this kind frequently relies on precisely this sort of specificity in its minor roles, using small but vivid visual and behavioral details, a distinctive haircut, a particular posture, to make even briefly glimpsed antagonists memorable enough that their deaths register as concrete events rather than abstract body count filler. Lin Dan Fam's Pretty Ninja and the anonymity of the clan's foot soldiers. Lin Dan Fam's role, credited as Pretty Ninja, occupies an interesting position within the film's broader treatment of the Ozunu Clan's rank-and-file assassins. Unlike Raizo, Kiriko, Tokishi, or Lord Ozunu, all of whom are given names, backstories, and individualized arcs, the majority of the clan's assassins who appear throughout the film's various combat sequences remain deliberately anonymous, distinguishable primarily through visual details, masks, weapons, and in this case, an explicitly noted attractiveness, rather than through any individualized narrative identity. This anonymity is not an oversight but a structural choice consistent with the film's broader thematic interest in the Ozunu Clan as a dehumanizing machine that manufactures interchangeable killers, stripping its recruits of individual identity in service of the organization's operational needs. That one of these otherwise anonymous killers is specifically credited by a descriptor emphasizing her appearance, rather than by any name or narrative function, underscores this dynamic even at the level of the film's own production paperwork. Even in death, or in combat, these clan members are categorized by surface characteristics rather than individual identity, a small but telling reflection of the film's broader interest in the erasure of selfhood the Ozunu Clan's training regimen enacts upon its recruits. Grounding the production, Berlin's character actors. A cluster of roles: Yu Fang as laundromat manager, Adriana Altaraz as landlady, Eleanor Weisgerber as Mrs. Sabatin, and Vladimir Tarasjans as Alexei Sabatin, reveal something important about the film's production geography that might otherwise be easy to overlook amid discussion of its higher-profile international leads. These are precisely the kinds of small, localized character roles that reflect a production genuinely shot on location, in this case largely in Berlin, drawing on the city's own pool of professional character actors to populate the incidental, everyday texture of scenes rather than relying entirely on imported talent for every speaking role. Adriana Altaraz and Eleanor Weisgerber, both performers with substantial careers within German film and television, bring to their comparatively minor roles a specific regional authenticity, the sense of a film that is not merely using a European city as an interchangeable backdrop but is genuinely populated, down to its smallest speaking roles, by performers native to and reflective of that setting. This detail matters for understanding the film's overall production identity. Ninja Assassin, whatever its mythic ninja clan subject matter and East Asian cast members, is also, at a very concrete production level, a European genre film, shot substantially in Germany and staffed at every level, including its smallest incidental roles, by German industry professionals. The presence of names like Vladimir Tarasjans, playing a character whose surname, Sabatin, alongside his co-star Eleanor Weisgerber's character Mrs. Sabatin, suggests a small domestic subplot or incidental scene involving a couple whose Eastern European-inflected surname hints at the broader immigrant and international texture of contemporary Berlin, the kind of granular social detail that a production genuinely embedded in its shooting location can achieve almost incidentally, simply by drawing on the specific human texture of the city in which it filmed. One of the more striking features of this cast list, when considered as a totality, is the sheer number of credited roles devoted to Europol personnel. Thorsten Mandalay as Europol agent Zabransky, Guido Vorweiser as lead Europol agent, Tim Williams as Europol cell guard, David Leach as Europol door guard, Wolfgang Stegman as Europol point man, Stefan Groth and Jens Neuhaus as Europol guards, Patrick Pinheiro as Maslow's aide, Matthias Schendel as task force agent, and Johannes On as medic. This extended roster of named, if individually minor, institutional roles serves a clear dramatic function. It renders Europol not as an abstract institutional backdrop. but as a populated, specific bureaucratic and tactical apparatus, one with enough individually credited personnel that the film's safehouse siege and mountain retreat assault sequences can draw on a genuinely large and specific pool of characters, guards, agents, medics, aides, rather than relying on generic, unnamed extras to fill out its institutional set pieces. This level of granularity in credited institutional roles is particularly significant for the film's action climax, since a siege or assault sequence gains considerably in tension and stakes when the personnel involved have been established, even minimally, as specific individuals with specific functions, a point man, a medic, a cell guard, rather than as an undifferentiated tactical mass. The film's evident investment in staffing its Europol apparatus with this many individually credited roles suggests a production genuinely attentive to the texture of institutional procedure, treating the law enforcement side of its narrative with a degree of specificity that matches, even if it does not always dramatically equal, the mythic specificity afforded to the Ozunu Clan's own internal hierarchy. David Leitch's Door Guard, a retrospective curiosity. Among this extended roster of Europol personnel, one name stands out for reasons that only become fully apparent with the benefit of hindsight. David Leitch, credited here in the minor role of Europol Door Guard, would go on to become one of the most significant figures in contemporary action filmmaking, first as a stunt performer and stunt coordinator of considerable renown, and subsequently as a director whose credits would come to include some of the defining action films of the following decade, films built around exactly the kind of hyper-stylized, kinetic, and brutally choreographed violence that Ninja Assassin itself was attempting, with varying degrees of success, to achieve. Leitch's presence in this cast, in a role of minimal narrative significance, is one of those details that transforms retrospective viewing of a film into an act of historical detection. Knowing what Leitch would later accomplish as a director of action cinema recontextualizes his small on-screen appearance here as something closer to an apprenticeship moment, a stunt professional working within a production whose action aesthetic, and whose broader industrial network of choreographers, coordinators, and performers, would go on to directly inform the visual language of the action films he himself would eventually direct. This is a pattern worth noting more broadly in genre film credit lists of this era. The stunt community working on any given action production of the 2000s often included performers who would, within a decade, ascend to directing chairs themselves, bringing with them the specific choreographic sensibilities, the emphasis on practical stunt work, sustained takes, and brutal, grounded combat, that they had absorbed while working as performers on films like Ninja Assassin. Leitch's minor credited appearance here is, in this light, less a curiosity than a data point in a broader, traceable lineage connecting the stunt-driven action aesthetic of the late 2000s to the directorial sensibilities that would define mainstream action cinema a decade later. Small roles, concrete worlds, the remaining credits. The film's remaining credited roles, Richard Van Weyden as Ibn Battuta, Mina Gauci as Kid with Envelope, Hans Holbein as Mika's neighbor, Stephen Marcus as Kingpin, Nhingoc Nguyen Herman as Girl on Roof, and Kai Fung Reek as Teenage Tokishi, each contribute small but specific pieces of texture to the film's broader world. The choice to name a character Ibn Battuta, evoking the famous medieval traveler and chronicler, suggests a piece of playful or thematically resonant naming for what is otherwise a minor role, perhaps gesturing toward themes of travel, hidden knowledge, or the transmission of secret histories across cultures and centuries, concerns that resonate with the film's broader interest in a hidden, ancient organization whose reach and methods have persisted invisibly into the contemporary era. Stephen Marcus's casting as Kingpin, a performer whose career includes memorable supporting turns in British crime cinema, brings a recognizable heavies presence to what the credit's simple, archetypal title suggests is a criminal authority figure encountered somewhere within the film's underworld sequences. Kai Fung Reek's role as Teenage Tokishi performs the same function for Rick Yoon's character that Sungwon Yoon and Lee Jun perform for Raizo and that Kylie Leah Goldstein performs for Kiriko, establishing that even the film's secondary antagonist has a developmental history within the clan. That Tokishi's eventual willingness to execute his own sister on Lord Ozunu's orders is not simply an adult character trait but the culmination of his own years of training within the same brutalizing system that shaped Raizo. This detail, easy to overlook amid the film's larger cast, quietly reinforces the film's consistent thematic interest in tracing its major characters' capacities for violence and loyalty back to their childhood formation within the Ozunu Clan system, suggesting that the film's screenplay, whatever its structural unevenness in blending mythic and institutional thriller registers, maintained a consistent commitment to grounding its characters' adult behavior in specific, dramatized childhood experience wherever the production's resources allowed for it. Taken as a whole, the Ninja Assassin cast list functions as a remarkably rich document for understanding the film's specific industrial and creative circumstances, a Berlin-based production drawing deeply on German character acting talent for its incidental and institutional roles. A lead performance built through a deliberate architecture of age-doubled casting reflecting genuine investment in psychological continuity across a character's life, a supporting cast whose members' subsequent career trajectories, Anna Sawai's ascension to major prestige television roles, Sung Kang's established ensemble action persona, David Leitch's transformation from stunt performer to major action director, retrospectively illuminate the specific talent networks and industrial moment from which the film emerged, and a dense roster of institutional and incidental roles that reflects a production committed to rendering both its ancient ninja clan mythology and its contemporary European law enforcement apparatus with a comparable degree of populated specificity. Reading through this list is, in its own quiet way, a form of film history, a record of a moment when several careers intersected briefly within a single mid-budget genre production, some of those careers already established, others barely beginning, in ways that the finished film itself, focused as it necessarily is on its central narrative concerns, could never fully register or anticipate. Every film has an official origin story, the tidy anecdote repeated in press notes and retrospective interviews that smooths a messy, contingent, often anxious production process into a clean narrative of creative vision realized. The production history of Ninja Assassin, though, is unusual in how openly its own participants have acknowledged the chaos underlying its creation, rather than papering over it with the usual promotional gloss. J. Michael Straczynski's own account of receiving a phone call from the Wachowskis, being handed a screenplay that had fallen short of what its producers wanted, and being told that a start date was locked in a mere 6 weeks away, with actors needing final pages by that Friday, reads less like the origin story of a polished studio genre picture and more like an account of a rescue mission conducted under extreme time pressure. That Straczynski would go on to describe writing an entirely new draft of the screenplay in 53 continuous hours, fueled by nothing more sophisticated than a pot of coffee and an approaching deadline, gives the film's production history a texture of genuine, high-stakes improvisation that is worth examining closely, both for what it reveals about how mid-budget genre films actually get made under the pressures of a locked production calendar, and for what it suggests about the specific creative fingerprint such an accelerated process would inevitably leave on the finished film. This anecdote deserves to be taken seriously as more than mere colorful trivia, because it fundamentally reframes how one should think about the screenplay's structural characteristics, discussed at length in relation to the film's narrative itself, the sometimes uneasy collision between mythic origin story material centered on Raizo's childhood and a more conventional institutional conspiracy thriller plotline centered on Mika Coretti's investigation. A screenplay substantially reconceived and rewritten within 53 hours by a single writer working against an immovable production deadline is almost definitionally not going to achieve the kind of seamless structural integration that might result from a longer, more iterative development process involving multiple rounds of notes, revision, and refinement. Straczynski's task was not to polish an already strong draft but to essentially reconstruct the entire architecture of the film's screenplay from a foundation he considered inadequate, all while the clock continued running toward a start date that could not be moved. Understanding this genesis helps explain, without excusing, some of the narrative seams that later critics would identify in the finished film. A script assembled at this velocity, however talented its author, is always going to bear some trace of its own emergency conditions. The Wachowskis, trust, and the logic of the emergency phone call. It is worth pausing on the specific relational dynamic embedded in Straczynski's account. He describes the Wachowskis as friends who called him directly, rather than a producing team going through the ordinary channels of agents, submissions, and studio-mediated hiring processes that typically govern the assignment of a rewrite job on a major studio production. This detail matters because it illuminates something important about how creative relationships within the industry function at moments of genuine crisis. When a production finds itself with an inadequate screenplay and an immovable start date, the standard, bureaucratically mediated processes of screenwriter selection, competitive submissions, studio-approved lists of acceptable rewrite candidates, extended negotiation over credit and compensation, become luxuries that a 6-week runway simply cannot accommodate. What takes their place, in circumstances like these, is exactly the kind of direct, trust-based relationship Straczynski describes, a phone call between friends and long-standing collaborators, a meeting the very next day, and an almost immediate commitment to undertake what amounts to a screenplay reconstruction under conditions that would make most writers, reasonably, hesitate. The Wachowskis' willingness to reach out to Straczynski specifically, rather than to any of the numerous other screenwriters who might plausibly have been available for hire on short notice, reflects a calculated bet on a specific kind of creative compatibility. Straczynski's most famous body of work prior to this point, particularly his television writing on serialized science fiction material, had established him as a writer with a particular facility for constructing dense mythological backstory and layering it into narratives that unfold across multiple registers of time. Exactly the kind of skill set that a film needing to weave together a mythic ninja clan origin story with a contemporary institutional thriller would require. The Wachowskis, themselves filmmakers whose own body of work displays a persistent fascination with hidden orders, secret histories, and layered mythological worldbuilding, seem to have recognized in Straczynski a writer whose established strengths mapped directly onto the specific structural challenge Ninja Assassin's screenplay needed to solve. This was not, in other words, simply an emergency hire made out of desperation and convenience, though the timeline certainly involved both. It was also, evidently, a considered judgment about which available writers' specific skills were best suited to the particular kind of reconstruction the material required. The specific detail of 53 hours, offered by Straczynski with what reads as a mixture of pride and lingering exhaustion even in retrospective recounting, deserves consideration as a piece of information about the physical and psychological conditions under which certain kinds of studio filmmaking actually get produced, conditions rarely visible to audiences who encounter only the finished, polished product on screen. Screenwriting, in its ordinary, non-emergency mode, is generally understood, even within the industry, as a process involving extended periods of research, outlining, drafting, and revision, frequently stretched across many weeks or months, with natural breaks for reflection, notes from producers or studio executives, and iterative refinement. The compressed, continuous 53-hour writing session Straczynski describes represents something categorically different, not measured development but a kind of creative sprint undertaken under conditions that more closely resemble crisis management than conventional artistic process. This detail also helps explain certain qualities of the finished screenplay that a purely textual analysis might otherwise struggle to account for. A script written this quickly, however skilled its author, is likely to rely more heavily on structural intuition and genre convention than on the kind of meticulously engineered plotting that longer development processes tend to produce. Straczynski's own established comfort with mythic backstory, chosen one narratives, and secret organizational hierarchies would have given him a set of pre-existing structural templates to draw upon rapidly, rather than needing to invent an entirely novel narrative architecture from nothing within the available time. The film's heavy reliance on flashback structure to convey Raizo's childhood trauma, its clear chosen successor mythology surrounding his position within the Ozunu Clan, and its willingness to let the institutional Europol plotline run somewhat in parallel to, rather than fully integrated with, the mythic ninja material, all read differently once one understands they emerged from a 53-hour writing marathon rather than from a leisurely, iterative development process. What might otherwise be read as structural indiscipline can, with this context, be more charitably understood as the visible trace of a writer drawing efficiently on well-worn, reliable narrative architecture precisely because the time available made genuine structural invention from scratch impractical. Matthew Sand's initial draft and the question of authorship. The credited screenplay for Ninja Assassin lists both Matthew Sand and J. Michael Straczynski, a dual credit that reflects the film's actual compositional history. Sand's initial draft, evidently judged by the Wachowskis to have fallen short of the vision they wanted to realize, and Straczynski's subsequent emergency reconstruction undertaken within the 6-week window before cameras were scheduled to roll. This kind of layered authorship, common enough in studio filmmaking but rarely discussed with the candor Straczynski brings to his own account, raises interesting questions about how to properly attribute a finished film's specific creative choices when its screenplay passed through more than one substantially different authorial hand under such compressed and pressured circumstances. It would be a mistake to read this dual credit as implying some clean division of labor, with Sand responsible for one identifiable half of the material and Straczynski for another. Straczynski's own description of the assignment, a whole new script rather than a revision of the existing one, suggests something closer to a wholesale reconstruction than a collaborative refinement of Sand's foundational work. Yet certain elements of the finished film's structure, particularly its institutional, present-day conspiracy thriller plotline centered on Europol's investigation into the Ozunu Clan's activities, plausibly represent material that survived from an earlier conception of the story, whether from Sand's original draft or from story elements the Wachowskis had already locked in before either writer's involvement, elements Straczynski would then have needed to accommodate and integrate into his Rapid reconstruction of the mythic Raizo material. This layered, contested question of authorship is, in itself, a useful reminder of how genre filmmaking of this scale actually operates, rarely as the expression of a single controlling authorial voice but rather as a negotiated, often improvised collaboration between writers, directors, and producers, each contributing and revising material under commercial and scheduling pressures that leave relatively little room for the kind of unified creative vision that auteurist film criticism sometimes imagines as the norm. The dual screenplay credit on Ninja Assassin stands as an honest bureaucratic record of exactly this kind of layered, pressured collaborative process, even if the finished film's marketing and reception rarely dwelt on the specific mechanics of how its script actually came together. James McTeigue and the continuity of the Wachowski collaborative circle. James McTeigue's position as director places Ninja Assassin within a specific, traceable lineage of collaboration extending back through his prior work with the Wachowskis and Joel Silver on V for Vendetta, released 4 years before Ninja Assassin reached theaters. This continuity of collaborative relationships matters for understanding how a production capable of absorbing the kind of emergency screenplay reconstruction Straczynski describes could function at all without collapsing into chaos. McTeigue's established working relationship with both the Wachowskis and Silver meant that the director stepping into this production already possessed a deep, pre-existing understanding of his producer's aesthetic sensibilities, their tolerance for stylized, operatic violence, their interest in secret hierarchical organizations and hidden orders governing ordinary reality, and their general visual and tonal preferences, built through the shared experience of having already brought one major genre film to the screen together. This prior relationship likely functioned as a kind of stabilizing force precisely at the moment when the screenplay itself was undergoing its most turbulent, compressed period of reconstruction. A director encountering unfamiliar producers for the first time, faced with a screenplay being entirely rewritten within a 6-week pre-production window, would face a substantially higher degree of uncertainty and risk than a director who had already spent an entire previous production learning how to translate those same producers' sensibilities into finished cinematic material. McTeigue's role, in this sense, extended beyond the conventional directorial function of realizing a screenplay on screen. His established fluency in the Wachowskis' particular creative language likely provided crucial continuity and confidence precisely during the period when the screenplay's own continuity was most acutely under threat. McTeigue's background as an assistant director on the Wachowskis' earlier Matrix trilogy, prior to his own ascension to a directing career, further deepens this lineage, situating Ninja Assassin within a broader continuous thread of collaborative relationships stretching back across multiple productions and roughly a decade of shared creative work. This kind of long-term collaborative continuity, filmmakers returning again and again to work with the same trusted colleagues across different individual projects, is a common enough pattern within genre filmmaking. But the specific stress test this particular production placed on that continuity, an emergency screenplay reconstruction compressed into 6 weeks, makes Ninja Assassin a particularly clear illustration of how valuable such established working relationships become precisely at moments of production crisis. Rain, Speed Racer, and the genesis of a casting decision. The account of the Wachowskis' inspiration for the project itself, having been sufficiently impressed by Rain's ninja-inflected fight choreography in their own 2008 film Speed Racer to conceive of building an entire feature film around his physical performance capabilities, offers a valuable window into how genre film projects sometimes originate not from a pre-existing screenplay or literary property but from a specific performer's demonstrated on-screen physical capability, observed and then retroactively built into a vehicle designed to showcase it further. This is a meaningfully different genesis story than the more familiar pattern of adapting an existing novel, comic book, or previous film into a new screenplay. Here, the germinating idea appears to have been almost entirely performer-driven, a producing team recognizing in an already completed collaboration a physical talent whose full potential their existing project had not been designed to fully exploit, and then conceiving an entirely new project specifically engineered to give that talent its own dedicated showcase. This detail also helps explain the specific character of Raizo as constructed across the finished screenplay, and the earlier observation that his characterization relies heavily on physical presence and controlled, precise movement rather than extensive dialogue or conventional dramatic exposition. If the project's very conception traces back to the Wachowskis' appreciation of Rain's physical performance capabilities as demonstrated in a prior film, it follows naturally that the eventual screenplay, whatever combination of Sands and Straczynski's contributions shaped it, would be built to prioritize and showcase exactly that physical dimension of Rain's performance, constructing a character whose primary mode of expression is disciplined, legible bodily movement rather than verbal or emotionally expressive acting in the conventional dramatic sense. The film's fight choreography, in other words, is not merely a genre convention layered onto an otherwise separately conceived narrative, it is arguably the film's actual reason for existing in the first place, the seed around which the entire production subsequently grew. Sho Kosugi and the deliberate invocation of genre history. James McTeigue's own characterization of Sho Kosugi, asserting flatly that anyone familiar with 1980s ninja cinema understands Kosugi to be, in an almost definitional sense, the ninja, confirms directly what close analysis of the finished film's casting choices already suggested, that Kosugi's presence in Ninja Assassin was conceived and executed as a deliberate act of genre citation, an acknowledgement on the production's part that it understood itself to be operating within and consciously extending a specific, historically bounded lineage of American ninja cinema that Kosugi himself had substantially helped establish decades earlier. McTeigue's phrasing here is worth attending to closely. He does not simply say that Kosugi had experience playing ninja roles, a statement of mere resume fact, but asserts something closer to an identity claim, that Kosugi effectively is the ninja as a cultural and cinematic category, a statement that only makes sense within the context of a very specific genre history that McTeigue evidently expected his audience, or at least genre-literate portions of it, to recognize and appreciate. This casting choice, then, functions on at least two simultaneous levels within the finished film. On the narrative level, discussed extensively in relation to the story itself, Kosugi's Lord Ozunu serves as the corrupting patriarchal figure whose exploitation of orphan children constitutes the moral center of the film's villainy. But on a metatextual level, visible primarily to audiences already familiar with Kosugi's earlier body of work, his casting also stages a kind of generational passing of the torch within the ninja genre itself, an actor who once embodied heroic possibilities within American ninja cinema of the 1980s now positioned as the villain from whom a new generation's protagonist, Rain's Raizo, must free himself. Whether or not this metatextual dimension registered with the film's broader theatrical audience, who may have encountered Kosugi with limited or no awareness of his earlier genre-defining work, McTeigue's own statement makes clear that the production itself was fully conscious of and deliberately leveraging this citational dimension of the casting. The revelation that Lord Ozunu's name derives from Ien no Ozunu, a historical 7th-century Japanese mystic credited as one of the founding figures in the development of ninjutsu, adds an additional layer of deliberate historical grounding to a character who might otherwise register simply as a generic villain archetype. This naming choice reflects a broader strategy common in genre worldbuilding, in which invented characters and organizations are given names deliberately drawn from genuine historical or mythological sources, lending an invented fictional hierarchy a borrowed weight and authenticity derived from real historical and cultural material even when the specific narrative built around that name is entirely fictional. Ien no Ozunu, sometimes rendered in other transliterations as Ien no Gyoja, occupies a genuinely significant position within Japanese religious and martial history as a semi-legendary ascetic figure associated with Shugendo, a syncretic mountain worship tradition that some later ninjutsu traditions claim as part of their own historical lineage, whether through documented historical continuity or through later mythologizing retroactively constructing such continuity. By naming its fictional clan leader after this genuine historical figure, the screenplay signals an ambition to root its invented Ozunu Clan within a plausible, if heavily fictionalized, historical lineage extending back to the actual documented and legendary origins of ninjutsu as a martial and spiritual practice, rather than presenting the clan as a wholly invented, historically unmoored fantasy organization. Whether this etymological grounding registers consciously with the film's general audience, most of whom would have no specific familiarity with Ien no Ozunu's historical significance, the choice nonetheless reflects a level of research-driven attentiveness to genuine ninjutsu history and tradition that a purely commercial-minded, citation-free approach to villain naming would not have required. This attention to authentic historical grounding sits in an interesting tension with the film's otherwise heavily stylized, deliberately exaggerated approach to ninja mythology, its supernatural-tinged shadow manipulation techniques and its operatically excessive violence bearing little resemblance to any historically grounded account of actual ninjutsu practice. The film seems to want, simultaneously, the invented, exaggerated spectacle of its shadow-blending technique and blood-soaked combat sequences, and the borrowed authenticity of grounding its villain's name in genuine historical scholarship on ninjutsu's origins, a combination that speaks to the broader hybrid identity of the production as a whole. A film pulling simultaneously toward pulpy genre exaggeration and toward a degree of earnest historical and cultural research underlying even its most fantastical elements. Berlin as production site, the economics of international film financing. The film's substantial financing from German sources, $1 million in funding from Medienboard Berlin-Brandenburg and a considerably larger contribution of $9 million from Germany's Federal Film Fund, reveals an important and often underappreciated dimension of how mid-budget international genre productions of this era actually secured their financing. Rather than relying exclusively on a single American studio's production budget, Ninja Assassin's financing structure reflects the increasingly common practice, particularly prominent through the 2000s, of American and international productions seeking out regional and national film funds willing to provide substantial financial incentives, frequently tied to requirements around local shooting, local crew employment, and local post-production work, in exchange for the prestige, employment, and infrastructure investment that hosting a significant international production brings to that region's film industry. This financing structure directly explains the film's substantial Berlin shooting location, previously discussed in relation to the cast list's dense population of German character actors and, presumably, German crew and stunt personnel working alongside the film's international principal cast. The $9 million provided by Germany's Federal Film Fund alone represents a very substantial portion of what would have been, for a film of this genre and scale, a moderate but not enormous overall production budget, meaning German public and quasi-public film financing bodies effectively became major stakeholders in the production's viability, a fact that helps explain why the finished film so thoroughly integrates German locations, German character actors in speaking roles ranging from landladies to neighbors to institutional personnel, and, quite plausibly, a substantial portion of below-the-line crew and stunt work sourced from within the German film industry. This dimension of the production's financing also illuminates something important about the broader economics of genre filmmaking during this period. Films like Ninja Assassin, occupying a mid-budget tier that made them attractive candidates for this kind of regional co-financing arrangement without necessarily requiring the enormous, self-sufficient budgets of the era's biggest blockbusters, increasingly relied on precisely this kind of patchwork international financing structure, stitching together contributions from studio backing, regional film funds, and other co-financing sources to assemble budgets sufficient for their ambitions. The specific combination of American studio distribution through Warner Brothers, producing entities spanning Legendary Pictures, Dark Castle Entertainment, and Silver Pictures, and substantial German public film financing bodies reflects the genuinely international, multi-source character of Ninja Assassin's financial architecture, a structure invisible to audiences encountering only the finished film but essential to understanding how a project of this genre and scale actually became financially viable within the production landscape of the late 2000s. Returning, finally, to the specific temporal constraint that structures the entire production narrative recounted here, the 6-week window between the Wachowskis' initial phone call to Straczynski and the locked start of principal photography, it is worth considering how thoroughly this compressed timeline would have propagated its effects across every subsequent stage of the production process, not merely the screenplay itself. A production proceeding toward an immovable start date while its screenplay remained in active, emergency reconstruction would have placed extraordinary pressure on every downstream department simultaneously, casting decisions needing to be finalized even as character details continued shifting under Straczynski's rewrite, location scouting and set construction proceeding on the basis of scene requirements that might themselves still be in flux, costume and prop departments working from character and story specifications that had not yet been fully locked, and stunt choreography, an especially significant consideration for a film built so centrally around Rain's physical performance capabilities, needing to be developed and rehearsed against a shifting understanding of exactly what combat sequences the final screenplay would actually require. That the production nonetheless proceeded successfully to camera on schedule, delivering a finished film that, whatever its ultimately mixed critical reception, achieved coherent theatrical release and moderate commercial success, speaks to the considerable organizational capacity of an experienced producing team working with an established director and a substantial international financing and crew infrastructure already in place. The 6-week emergency rewrite, in this light, stands not as an isolated anecdote about screenwriting under pressure but as the visible tip of a much larger production-wide exercise in managing risk and uncertainty under severe time constraints, one that this particular collaborative team, bound together by prior successful work on V for Vendetta and by the kind of trust-based relationships that allow for exactly the sort of emergency phone call Straczynski describes, proved sufficiently Practiced and cohesive to navigate successfully, even if the resulting screenplay would carry, in its finished form, some of the structural traces of the emergency conditions under which it was written. Principal photography on Ninja Assassin commenced in Berlin at the end of April 2008, with production based substantially at Babelsberg Studios and supplemented by location shooting throughout the city itself. The choice of Babelsberg as a production base deserves attention beyond its purely practical function as a facility offering sound stages and technical infrastructure, because Babelsberg occupies a genuinely singular position within the broader history of European filmmaking, one that inevitably colors how a production choosing to shoot their positions itself, whether consciously or not, within a much longer lineage of cinematic craft. Babelsberg's origins stretch back to the earliest decades of the 20th century, making it among the oldest continuously operating large-scale film production facilities in the world, a site that had already hosted, across the many decades preceding Ninja Assassin's arrival, an enormous range of German and international productions spanning silent-era expressionist classics through the studio's various transformations across shifting political regimes and, eventually, its re-emergence in the post-reunification era as a significant hub for international co-productions seeking access to skilled German crews, favorable financing arrangements, and world-class technical facilities at costs generally more attractive than equivalent capacity in Hollywood or London. For a production like Ninja Assassin, arriving at Babelsberg in 2008, this meant access not merely to physical soundstage space but to an entire accumulated infrastructure of specialized technical crews, many of whom had built careers working across decades of the studio's various international co-productions, developing exactly the kind of practical expertise in servicing large-scale, effects-heavy genre productions that a film built around extensive stunt choreography, practical blood effects, and stylized combat sequences would require. The specific combination of substantial German public financing, discussed in relation to the film's production history, and Babelsberg's mature production infrastructure reflects a broader pattern in which the studio had positioned itself, by the late 2000s, as an increasingly attractive destination for exactly this category of internationally financed, moderately budgeted genre production, offering American and international producers a combination of financial incentive and technical capability difficult to match through purely domestic American production. The supplementary location shooting throughout Berlin itself, beyond the controlled environment of the studio's sound stages, connects directly back to the earlier observation regarding the film's cast list and its dense population of German character actors in small, localized roles, landladies, neighbors, laundromat managers. A production combining substantial studio-based work with genuine location shooting across the city gains a specific kind of texture that purely soundstage-bound filmmaking cannot replicate, real architectural specificity, incidental urban detail, and the kind of granular locational authenticity that helps ground even a film centrally concerned with mythic Ninja Clan material and shadow manipulation techniques within a recognizably concrete, contemporary European urban setting. This grounding matters thematically as much as aesthetically, since the film's institutional Europol plotline in particular depends on a sense of contemporary, bureaucratically real European urban space against which the more fantastical elements of the Ozunu Clan's activities can register as genuinely intrusive and destabilizing, an ancient, hidden system of violence erupting into the visible, documented fabric of a real, recognizable contemporary city. McTeigue's influences, reading a director's reference points. James McTeigue's own account of the films that shaped his approach to directing Ninja Assassin, citing Panic in the Streets from 1950, The Getaway from 1972, Badlands from 1973. Panic in the Streets, Elia Kazan's 1950 film noir concerning a public health official racing against time to contain a plague outbreak traced through the criminal underworld of New Orleans, might initially seem an incongruous reference point for a stylized Ninja Assassin film, until one considers the specific structural and tonal qualities McTeigue likely drew from it: a taut, propulsive narrative built around pursuit and urgency, a documentary-inflected visual realism grounding even its most heightened dramatic stakes in the concrete, unglamorous texture of real urban locations, and a narrative structure that interweaves official, institutional investigation with the more shadowy, underworld-adjacent movements of its central figures. This structural template, official institutional pursuit intercut with underworld intrigue, maps with surprising directness onto Ninja Assassin's own dual-plotted structure, Mika Coretti's Europol investigation running parallel to and eventually intersecting with Raizo's more shadowy, personal war against the Ozunu Clan. McTeigue's citation of a decades-old, black-and-white film noir classic as an influence on a contemporary ninja action film suggests a directorial sensibility interested less in the surface genre trappings of martial arts cinema than in borrowing proven structural strategies from an entirely different cinematic tradition, using noir's established grammar of institutional pursuit and urban shadow to help organize and pace his own film's parallel narrative tracks. The Getaway, Sam Peckinpah's 1972 crime thriller centered on a couple fleeing across the American landscape after a heist goes wrong, brings a different set of qualities into McTeigue's stated influences. Peckinpah's own signature interest in stylized, often balletic and slow-motion inflected violence, combined with a fatalistic, pursuit-driven narrative structure in which characters are perpetually on the move, hunted by both criminal and institutional forces simultaneously. Peckinpah's broader reputation as a director whose treatment of violence pushed against the conventions of mainstream American cinema of his era, rendering bloodshed with an operatic, almost aestheticized intensity that shocked contemporary audiences and critics even as it proved enormously influential on subsequent generations of action filmmakers, connects directly to the discussion, in relation to Ninja Assassin's narrative and critical reception, of the film's own controversially excessive approach to on-screen violence. McTeigue's citation of Peckinpah's work as a direct influence confirms that this excessive violence was not an incidental or uncontrolled byproduct of the production but a deliberate aesthetic choice, consciously modeled on a specific, historically significant lineage of stylized cinematic bloodshed extending back through Peckinpah's own genre-redefining work of the early 1970s. Badlands, Terrence Malick's 1973 film chronicling a young couple's violent cross-country flight, contributes yet another dimension to this reference constellation, one perhaps less immediately obvious in its application to Ninja Assassin but nonetheless illuminating. Malick's film is celebrated less for its violence, though violence is certainly present within its narrative, than for its distinctive tonal register, a lyrical, almost dreamlike visual style applied to fundamentally brutal, senseless material, creating a persistent and unsettling tension between aesthetic beauty and moral horror. This specific tension, between visual lyricism and narrative brutality, resonates strongly with the earlier discussion of Ninja Assassin's own visual approach to its Raizo Kiriko romantic material, particularly the wall-climbing motif that bookends the narrative, in which a moment of aching, almost tender visual beauty is paired directly with, or eventually followed by, extreme violence and loss. McTeigue's citation of Malick suggests an ambition, whether or not fully realized in the finished film's critical reception, to bring something of this same lyrical brutal tonal tension to a genre film whose more immediately obvious generic touchstones might not otherwise have suggested such an aspiration. The two explicitly Japanese-inflected references in McTeigue's list, the 1993 animated film Ninja Scroll and the anime television series Samurai Champloo, ground the director's influences directly within the specific genre tradition Ninja Assassin most explicitly belongs to and modernizes. Ninja Scroll, widely regarded as a landmark work within adult-oriented Japanese animation, is itself renowned for combining extraordinarily stylized, physically impossible combat choreography with a persistent undercurrent of body horror and genuinely disturbing violence, a combination that maps with obvious directness onto Ninja Assassin's own combination of balletic, superhuman ninja combat and graphically excessive bloodshed. Samurai Champloo, meanwhile, an anime series notable for its deliberately anachronistic fusion of traditional samurai-era Japanese setting with contemporary hip-hop aesthetics and musical sensibility, suggests a different but related influence, an interest in deliberately hybridizing historical Japanese genre material with contemporary, globally circulating popular culture forms, exactly the kind of hybridization Ninja Assassin itself attempts through its combination of ancient ninja clan mythology with a thoroughly contemporary European institutional thriller plotline, Europol investigations, tracking devices, and modern urban infiltration sequences laid directly against ritualized, centuries-old assassination traditions. Taken together, this constellation of five influences, spanning American film noir, 1970s New Hollywood crime cinema, and two distinct strands of Japanese animation, confirms that McTeigue approached Ninja Assassin not as a director working within a single, narrowly bounded genre tradition but as someone deliberately synthesizing reference points from across multiple national cinemas, historical periods, and media forms. This eclecticism helps explain, in a manner consistent with the earlier discussion of the screenplay's own hybrid structure, why the finished film reads less as a straightforward genre exercise than as a deliberate, if not always perfectly executed, act of cross-generic and cross-cultural synthesis, one whose ambitions become considerably clearer once a viewer understands the specific. The casting history revealing that Colin Cho was originally attached to an undisclosed lead role in the production, a role he ultimately departed before filming concluded, and that this casting had followed Jet Li's own decision to decline an offer to appear in the film, opens up a genuinely fascinating counterfactual dimension to the production's history, one worth dwelling on for what it reveals about the broader landscape of internationally bankable martial arts stardom during this period, and about the specific creative calculations that eventually shaped the film audiences actually received. Jet Li's position within the landscape of martial arts cinema by the late 2000s was considerably different from Rei's. Li had already achieved, across a lengthy career spanning both Chinese-language wuxia and martial arts cinema and a substantial run of English-language Hollywood vehicles, a level of established international martial arts stardom that made him an obvious first consideration for any Hollywood production seeking a bankable lead for a project centered on ninja or broader East Asian martial arts mythology. That Li declined the offer to appear in Ninja Assassin suggests, at minimum, that the project as then conceived did not align with whatever specific creative or career considerations were guiding Li's choices at that particular moment, though the specific reasons behind his decision remain part of the undisclosed texture of the production's development history rather than a matter of public record accompanying this account. Colin Cho's subsequent attachment to an unspecified lead role represents an interesting alternate path the production might have taken. Cho, an actor whose own career included significant credits in major martial arts and action franchises, would have brought to the production a different kind of established genre credibility than Rei's, one grounded more explicitly in prior martial arts and stunt action filmography rather than in Rei's musical performance-derived crossover stardom. That Cho was cast in an undisclosed lead role, without public specification of which character he was originally set to play, adds a layer of genuine mystery to this account. It remains unclear from the information available whether Cho was initially envisioned for the role that Rai ultimately filled, for another significant role that was later restructured or recast entirely, or for a character role that may have been substantially altered or removed during the screenplay's emergency reconstruction under Straczynski's rewrite. This latter possibility deserves particular consideration given everything already established about the compressed, chaotic nature of the screenplay's development. A production undergoing a complete emergency screenplay rewrite within a 6-week window before cameras rolled would very plausibly have seen significant alterations to character roles, arcs, and even existence, as the incoming writer reconstructed the narrative according to a substantially different vision than whatever draft had preceded it. It is entirely possible, though not confirmed by the account, that Cho's departure from the project was connected in some fashion to exactly this kind of screenplay-driven character restructuring, a role he had originally signed on to play simply ceasing to exist, or being substantially transformed, in the version of the script that emerged from Straczynski's rapid reconstruction. Whatever the precise mechanics of his departure, Cho's brief attachment and subsequent exit from the production stands as a reminder of how significantly the eventual casting and character composition of a finished film can diverge from earlier stages of its development, particularly for a production whose screenplay itself underwent such a dramatic and compressed process of revision. The iPhone game as marketing artifact and industrial signal. The release, on November 5, 2009, of a companion video game application for iPhone devices, published by Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment and timed to arrive just 3 weeks ahead of the film's own theatrical debut, deserves consideration as more than a minor footnote to the film's marketing campaign. This detail, modest as it might initially seem, actually reflects a genuinely significant inflection point within the broader history of film marketing and cross-media promotional strategy, one worth situating carefully within its specific technological and industrial moment. The iPhone itself, as a consumer device, had only been available to the public for a relatively short span of time by late 2009, having launched in 2007 and having only introduced its now foundational App Store distribution model in 2008, the year principal photography on Ninja Assassin itself began. This means that Ninja Assassin's companion mobile game arrived during a genuinely early and formative period in the development of mobile gaming as a promotional and commercial platform for film studios, well before the now thoroughly established industry practice of releasing mobile game tie-ins alongside major theatrical releases had become the routine, almost unremarkable marketing expectation it would become across the following decade. Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment's decision to develop and release such a tie-in for Ninja Assassin specifically, rather than reserving this kind of cross-media promotional investment exclusively for the studio's larger blockbuster franchise properties, suggests that the production and its parent studio recognized in the film's premise, stylized ninja combat rendered through fast, visually striking action, exactly the kind of content that would translate naturally into the touchscreen. Driven, gesture-based gameplay mechanics that early iPhone gaming was rapidly discovering as its own particular native strength. This detail also connects meaningfully to the film's broader identity as a genre property built substantially around physical spectacle and stylized combat, discussed extensively in relation to both its screenplay's origins in showcasing Rain's physical performance capabilities and its director's stated influences drawing on both live-action and animated sources celebrated for their kinetic combat sequences. A film whose core appeal rests so heavily on the visceral experience of stylized ninja combat represents almost ideal source material for translation into an early touchscreen game experience, where swiping, tapping, and gesture-based inputs could plausibly simulate, in simplified form, the same kind of quick, precise combat actions the film itself dramatizes through Raizo's fighting style. The mobile game tie-in, considered in this light, function not merely as generic ancillary merchandising but as a genuinely complementary extension of the film's own core appeal into an emerging medium whose particular affordances happen to align unusually well with the specific kind of content Ninja Assassin was built to deliver. The theatrical release date and its competitive context. The film's American theatrical release on November 25, 2009, situates Ninja Assassin within a specific and highly significant point on the annual theatrical release calendar, the days immediately surrounding the Thanksgiving holiday weekend, historically one of the most heavily trafficked and competitively contested periods in the American theatrical release calendar. This timing decision deserves consideration as a deliberate commercial strategy rather than an incidental scheduling accident, since studios plan theatrical release dates for major genre properties with considerable care, weighing factors including expected audience availability during holiday periods, anticipated competition from other films releasing in the same narrow window, and the specific demographic composition of holiday moviegoing audiences against the particular genre and audience profile a given film is expected to attract. The Thanksgiving corridor has historically functioned as an unusually reliable period for genre and action-oriented films seeking to capture audiences, particularly younger male demographics home from school or work during the extended holiday weekend, who represent exactly the core audience segment a hard-R stylized ninja action film would most naturally be expected to attract. Positioning Ninja Assassin's release within this specific window, rather than during a quieter, less competitively contested period earlier or later in the calendar year, suggests a deliberate strategic calculation on the part of Warner Bros. And the film's producing entities that the holiday period's typically robust overall theatrical attendance, even amid inevitable competition from other films releasing during the same narrow window, would provide the film with its best opportunity to reach the specific audience segment most likely to respond enthusiastically to its particular combination of stylized violence and martial arts spectacle. This release timing also connects back to the earlier discussion of the film's mixed critical reception set against its moderate commercial success. A film that draws sufficiently negative critical notices to generate an unfavorable overall critical consensus can nonetheless perform commercially well if it successfully reaches an audience whose interest in the film is driven by factors, genre appeal, star presence, the specific visceral appeal of stylized action spectacle, largely independent of critical consensus. Positioning the film's release within a holiday period known for particularly robust genre film attendance regardless of critical reception represents exactly the kind of strategic calculation that would help explain how Ninja Assassin managed to achieve profitable commercial performance even in the face of the critical dismissal much of the mainstream reviewing establishment extended toward it. Considering the production as an integrated whole. Taken together, the details examined here, the Babelsberg production base and its associated German crew infrastructure, McTeigue's eclectic and cross-cultural set of directorial influences, the ghost presence of Jet Li's declined involvement and Colin Cho's eventual departure from an undisclosed role, the early and strategically apt mobile game tie-in, and the deliberate Thanksgiving-adjacent release timing, together paint a picture of a production whose various components, however chaotic and compressed its screenplay's own development had been, ultimately cohered into a reasonably well-coordinated overall commercial and creative strategy. The film's eventual moderate commercial success, discussed at length in relation to its critical reception, becomes considerably easier to understand once these various production and marketing decisions are considered as an integrated whole, a director drawing on a genuinely eclectic and carefully considered set of cinematic influences to shape the film's tone and visual approach, a producing team securing substantial international financing and a mature, well-resourced production infrastructure at Babelsberg, and a distributor making a calculated decision about both the timing of the film's theatrical release and the specific cross-media promotional strategies, including an unusually early mobile game tie-in, best suited to reaching the film's target audience. None of this integrated strategic coordination, however carefully assembled, could fully compensate for the structural unevenness that the screenplay's own compressed and chaotic development history, discussed at length previously, left visible within the finished film. But considering the full scope of the production's actual historical circumstances, from its Berlin-based filming and its director's carefully chosen influences through its eventual marketing and release strategy, offers a considerably richer and more textured understanding of Ninja Assassin than a purely narrative or thematic analysis of the finished film could provide on its own. The film that eventually reached American theaters on that Thanksgiving weekend in 2009 was the product of an unusually specific and traceable set of industrial, financial, and creative circumstances, each of which left its own distinct imprint on the finished work audiences ultimately encountered. Before turning to what any individual critic actually said about Ninja Assassin, it is worth pausing on the specific instruments through which the film's critical reception has been quantified and preserved for posterity, because Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic are not neutral, transparent windows onto critical opinion but rather distinct methodological apparatuses that shape and compress the underlying diversity of critical response into single, easily circulated numbers. Rotten Tomatoes recorded a positive review rate of 26% across 117 counted critics, alongside an average numerical rating of 4.40 out of 10, while Metacritic, drawing on a considerably smaller pool of 20 mainstream critics and applying its own proprietary weighting methodology, arrived at a score of 34 out of 100, a figure the site itself categorizes as falling within the range of generally unfavorable reception. These two numbers, while broadly consistent with one another in signaling a critical consensus tilted decisively toward the negative, are worth understanding as measuring subtly different things. Rotten Tomatoes' headline percentage is fundamentally a binary tally, positive or negative, applied across a very large sample of reviews, many drawn from regional papers, smaller outlets, and online publications well beyond the narrower band of nationally prominent critics that Metacritic privileges through its weighting system, whereas Metacritic's weighted average reflects a more curated, more heavily weighted toward prestige outlet sample, translated into a graduated numerical score rather than a simple thumbs up or down count. The gap between these two figures, a 26% positive rate on one aggregator against what amounts to a 34 out of 100 weighted score on the other, though both clearly landing within negative territory, hints at the kind of methodological variance that makes any single number an imperfect proxy for the actual texture and diversity of critical response a film receives. A film scoring 26% positive on Rotten Tomatoes is not simply a film that 74% of critics disliked in some uniform, undifferentiated way. It is a film whose reception spanned everything from critics who found genuine merit in specific elements, its action choreography most commonly, while rejecting the whole, to critics who dismissed the film in near-total terms across every dimension of craft and content. The aggregator score flattens this range into a single figure precisely because that flattening is what makes such scores so efficient as consumer-facing shorthand, but the flattening also obscures much of what makes a genuinely close reading of the individual reviews worthwhile. The Rotten Tomatoes consensus and its diagnostic vocabulary. The consensus statement Rotten Tomatoes generated to summarize the aggregate critical response, characterizing the film as taking itself with an excessive gravity while suffering from editing choices critics found difficult to follow, and concluding that the film ultimately falls short of the exciting promise its title implies, deserves attention as a piece of compressed critical diagnosis worth unpacking on its own terms. The specific charge of excessive seriousness is a particularly interesting one to consider in relation to everything already established about the film's actual production history and thematic ambitions. A film whose screenplay, as discussed extensively in relation to its production, was substantially rebuilt around a mythic narrative of childhood trauma, inherited violence, and a doomed romance whose loss haunts the entire adult narrative, was always going to carry a certain weight of dramatic earnestness in its treatment of Raizo's backstory, an earnestness the finished film does not undercut with the kind of self-aware, tongue-in-cheek humor that might have leavened its darker material for audiences expecting a lighter, more straightforwardly entertaining genre romp. The consensus's charge of excessive seriousness, in other words, identifies a genuine and traceable tension within the film, a production whose commercial packaging, an R-rated ninja action spectacle timed for a holiday weekend release, primed audiences to expect visceral, unpretentious genre fun, delivered instead a narrative substantially preoccupied with trauma, guilt, and thwarted love, tonal register that a portion of the critical establishment evidently found mismatched with, or simply unearned by, the surrounding action spectacle packaging. The consensus's second major charge, targeting the film's editing as incomprehensible, points toward a different and more purely technical criticism, one concerning the legibility of the film's combat choreography itself. This criticism recurs across numerous individual reviews of action cinema from this general period, in which critics frequently complained that rapid cutting, close framing, and fast camera movement during fight sequences, techniques often employed specifically to disguise stunt doubling, to heighten a sense of chaotic violence, or simply to create maximal visual intensity, rendered the actual physical geography and choreography of combat difficult for audiences to track and appreciate. Whether this criticism reflects a genuine editorial shortcoming specific to Ninja Assassin or reflects a broader stylistic choice, common across a great deal of action cinema from this era, to prioritize visceral intensity over legible spatial clarity in combat sequences, the consensus's specific focus on this element suggests that whatever ambitions the production held for its combat choreography, ambitions traceable back to McTeigue's stated influences drawing on both live action and animated combat traditions celebrated for their visual clarity and kinetic precision, were not, in the critical establishment's judgment, fully realized in the finished film's editing. Individual critical voices, the rhetoric of dismissal. Turning from aggregate consensus to individual critical voices reveals a striking consistency in rhetorical strategy across several of the film's most negative notices, one built around a specific pattern of wordplay and genre-referencing dismissal that is worth examining as its own distinct critical mode. Mick LaSalle of the San Francisco Chronicle offered perhaps the most compact and rhythmically memorable formulation of this dismissive mode, characterizing the film through a triad of rhyming, portmanteau-style descriptors emphasizing excessive gore, tedium, and soporific dullness in a single tightly constructed phrase. The rhetorical craft of this particular dismissal deserves brief note in its own right. The deliberate rhyme scheme LaSalle constructs, stacking three compound words built on parallel structure, transforms what could have been a straightforward negative assessment into a quotable, almost aphoristic piece of critical writing, the kind of pull-quote-resistant construction, precisely because its wit is inseparable from its brevity, that nonetheless circulated widely as shorthand for the broader critical consensus surrounding the film. Joe Williams of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch pursued a different but related rhetorical strategy, one drawing explicitly on the film's own production lineage for its punchline. By constructing a pun directly off the title of McTeigue's and the Wachowskis' prior collaboration, suggesting the finished film might more accurately have been titled in reference to a discount home video bin rather than to its actual predecessor's more politically resonant title, Williams' critique functions on two levels simultaneously. It dismisses Ninja Assassin on its own individual merits as an amateurish, uncompelling piece of filmmaking, while also implicitly invoking the higher critical and cultural standing of V for Vendetta as an unfavorable point of comparison, suggesting that the same collaborative team responsible for a film treated with considerable critical seriousness had, in this instance, produced something closer to disposable, bargain bin genre filler. This comparative framing is a particularly pointed form of critical dismissal precisely because it does not evaluate Ninja Assassin in isolation but explicitly measures it against the more prestigious reputation of its maker's prior work, finding the newer film wanting not merely on absolute terms but specifically relative to what this same creative team had previously proven capable of achieving. Chris Nashawati and the critic who finds the object honestly. Among the reviews of Ninja Assassin, Chris Nashawati's notice for Entertainment Weekly stands out as a genuinely distinct critical voice, one that arrives at a broadly ambivalent assessment through a rhetorical strategy quite different from the dismissive wordplay of LaSalle or Williams. Nashawati's review acknowledges directly and without euphemism the film's connection to its producer's most famous prior work, describing the picture as a polished piece of martial arts chaos emerging from the same producing team behind a landmark science fiction franchise, before proceeding to characterize the film's violence in strikingly vivid, almost admiring terms, describing blood as spurting and spraying in geysers throughout the film's relentless runtime. What distinguishes Nashawati's approach from the more straightforwardly dismissive reviews already discussed is his willingness to identify a recurring structural rhythm within the film, noting the presence of a substantial and undeniably well-executed fight sequence roughly every 5 minutes, a piece of structural observation that reads less as complaint than as a kind of backhanded acknowledgement of the film's craft in delivering exactly the frequency and intensity of spectacle its genre positioning promised. Nashawati's concluding observation, framing the film's fundamental commercial and creative logic in blunt, almost cynically knowing terms, acknowledging that killing constitutes the film's actual business and that this particular business happens to be thriving, represents a genuinely different critical register than outright dismissal, an acknowledgement, delivered with a certain wry candor, that whatever reservations a critic might hold about the film's deeper thematic or dramatic ambitions, its core commercial proposition, delivering frequent, visually extravagant, brutally choreographed violence to an audience specifically seeking exactly that experience, was being fulfilled with genuine competence and even a certain grim efficiency. This is a meaningfully different kind of critical engagement than the reviews built primarily around dismissive wordplay, since Naomie's notice implicitly takes seriously the possibility that a film can be judged, at least in part, on the terms its own genre positioning establishes, rather than being measured against some external standard of dramatic seriousness or narrative coherence the film never claimed to be pursuing in the first place. The critical consensus on gore versus plot. Running through nearly all of the critical response surveyed here, whether expressed through LaSalle's rhythmic dismissal, Williams' comparative pun, or Naomie's more ambivalent acknowledgement, is a broadly shared critical framework positioning the film's violence and its narrative coherence as being in a kind of zero-sum tension with one another, with critics generally suggesting that whatever energy and craft the production invested in its combat sequences came at the direct expense of a coherent, engaging plot. This critical framework, common enough as a general pattern in the reception of genre action cinema across many decades, is worth interrogating somewhat rather than simply accepting as an accurate description of the film's actual balance of elements, particularly given the extensive plot analysis already undertaken elsewhere regarding the film's dual-registered narrative structure, its childhood trauma flashback architecture, and its attempt to weave together mythic revenge narrative with institutional conspiracy thriller. It seems likely that at least part of what critics experienced as a deficient or incoherent plot reflects not an absence of narrative ambition but rather the specific structural consequences of the compressed, emergency screenplay writing process discussed extensively in relation to the film's production history. A screenplay substantially reconstructed within 53 continuous hours of writing, however skilled its author, would plausibly produce exactly the kind of narrative that critics encountering it cold, without knowledge of its unusual compositional history, might reasonably experience as underdeveloped or insufficiently integrated in its plotting, not because the underlying thematic ambitions were themselves deficient but because the sheer time constraints under which the screenplay was assembled limited the degree of structural polish and integration a longer, more iterative development process might have achieved. The critical consensus's diagnosis of plot inadequacy, in this light, may be accurately identifying a real textual quality of the finished film while somewhat mischaracterizing its underlying cause, attributing to a lack of ambition or narrative interest what more plausibly reflects the specific, traceable production circumstances under which the screenplay was actually composed. Against this backdrop of decisively negative critical reception across virtually every major review outlet surveyed, the CinemaScore grade of B that the film received from surveyed opening weekend audiences stands as a genuinely significant data point, one that illuminates a phenomenon common enough in genre filmmaking but rarely quantified with such clarity: the frequent and sometimes substantial divergence between professional critical assessment and the immediate, visceral satisfaction reported by the specific audience segment that actually purchases tickets to see a given film on its opening weekend. CinemaScore's methodology, surveying audiences as they exit opening weekend screenings and asking them to grade the film they have just seen on a letter scale, captures something meaningfully different from the critical aggregator scores discussed previously, not a broad critical establishment's assessment of the film's artistic merit, technical craft, or narrative coherence measured against some implicit standard of what a film in this genre space ought to achieve, but rather the immediate, unmediated satisfaction of the specific self-selected audience that chose, of their own accord, to purchase a ticket to see this particular film on its opening weekend, an audience already substantially pre-selected for interest in and receptiveness toward exactly the kind of stylized ninja violence the film delivers. A B grade on CinemaScore's letter scale represents a solidly positive audience response, well above the threshold that would typically signal genuine audience disappointment or dissatisfaction, and its considerable distance from the decisively negative critical consensus captured by Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic illustrates with particular clarity a dynamic that runs throughout the reception history of genre action cinema more broadly, audiences specifically seeking a particular kind of visceral genre experience, stylized violence, spectacular combat choreography, an efficiently delivered string of action set pieces, often report considerably higher satisfaction with a film precisely engineered to deliver those specific pleasures than professional critics evaluating the same film against a broader and often more demanding set of criteria encompassing narrative coherence, thematic depth, technical polish, and comparative standing against a wider field of contemporary cinema. This divergence does not necessarily mean either the critics or the audiences were simply wrong in their respective assessments. Rather, it suggests that Ninja Assassin succeeded reasonably well at delivering the specific, narrower genre satisfactions its target audience sought, even as it failed to satisfy the broader, more exacting standards that professional film criticism typically applies across the full range of a film's craft and ambition. Domestic box office, a sixth-place opening in context. The film's North American theatrical opening, landing at the sixth position on the weekend box office chart with an opening gross of $13,316,158, deserves consideration within the specific competitive context of its Thanksgiving-adjacent release timing, discussed at length in relation to the film's overall release strategy. A sixth-place opening position is, on its own, a somewhat modest result, one that reflects a film competing for audience attention and screen availability within one of the most heavily trafficked and competitively crowded periods on the annual theatrical release calendar, a period in which numerous other major studio releases, including films aimed at the broader family and holiday audience demographic that Thanksgiving weekend traditionally attracts in large numbers, would have been competing directly for the same finite pool of available screens and moviegoing dollars. Considered against this competitive backdrop, an opening gross exceeding $13 million, even while landing outside the top 5 positions on the weekend chart, represents a result broadly consistent with what a mid-budget, hard-R genre film targeting a specific and somewhat narrower demographic segment, young adult and adult audiences specifically drawn to stylized action violence rather than the broader family-oriented audience the holiday weekend more typically attracts in its largest numbers, could reasonably expect to achieve. The film's eventual total North American gross of $38,122,883 suggests a theatrical run with reasonably steady, if unspectacular, holding power following its opening weekend, a pattern consistent with a film that, having found its core audience in its first days of release, continued to generate steady if not explosive returns across subsequent weeks rather than either collapsing rapidly due to poor audience word of mouth or building unusual momentum through positive audience buzz beyond its initial target demographic. The worldwide total and the weight of international markets. The film's total worldwide gross of $61,601,280, when set against its North American total of $38,122,883, reveals that international markets outside North America contributed a substantial majority of the film's total theatrical revenue, over $23 million, or roughly 38% of the worldwide total, generated from markets beyond the United States and Canada. This proportion is worth noting because it reflects a broader pattern increasingly common across genre and action cinema of this general period, in which international box office performance, rather than functioning as a secondary supplement to a film's primary domestic revenue, had become an increasingly central and sometimes dominant component of a mid-budget genre film's overall theatrical economics. This international revenue weighting connects meaningfully to several elements of the film's production and casting already discussed at length. Rain's substantial pre-existing international fame, particularly across Asian markets where his musical career had already established him as a performer with considerable audience recognition well before his casting in this film. The film's substantial German production financing and Berlin-based shooting, which plausibly helped cultivate audience interest and distributor support within European markets, and the broader international appeal of ninja-themed martial arts spectacle, a genre with deep roots and substantial audience enthusiasm extending well beyond any single national market. The film's Japanese theatrical release presents one of the more genuinely puzzling and analytically interesting details within its overall release history, one that rewards careful consideration precisely because it departs so substantially from the pattern one might otherwise expect for a film built so extensively around ninja mythology, a subject matter with obvious and deep cultural resonance within Japan itself, and starring a performer, Rain, with considerable pre-existing fame across broader Asian entertainment markets. Rather than opening in Japan simultaneously with or shortly after its American release in late November 2009, the film did not reach Japanese theaters until March 6, 2010, more than 3 months after its American debut, and even then opened in the singularly narrow context of just one movie theater in Tokyo's Shinjuku district, with an additional theater in Osaka not opening the film until a further 2 weeks later, on March 20. This unusually delayed and narrowly staged Japanese release pattern suggests a distributor calculation quite different from the wide, simultaneous global rollout strategy that major American studio releases increasingly favored by this period, particularly for genre properties expected to generate strong international interest. A single theater opening in one specific Tokyo district, rather than a wide release across multiple theaters and cities, is a release pattern more typically associated with smaller, specialty, or arthouse-oriented distribution strategies than with the kind of broad commercial rollout a major Warner Bros. Genre release might otherwise receive, and this choice likely reflects a calculated decision by the film's Japanese distributor to test audience response and generate word of mouth within a highly concentrated, easily monitored release context before committing to any broader theatrical expansion, rather than assuming the film's ninja subject matter and Rain star presence would guarantee automatic broad commercial success within the Japanese market specifically. The specific opening weekend figure recorded for the Shinjuku release, 2,214,000 yen, translating to approximately $25,672 in American currency at prevailing exchange rates, represents a genuinely modest figure when considered in absolute terms, though this modesty must be read against the extremely narrow release context of a single theater rather than as any kind of broader statement about the film's ultimate commercial reception across the full Japanese market. A single theater opening generating this level of revenue could, depending on the specific theater's typical capacity and ticket pricing, represent anything from a disappointing to a genuinely strong per-screen result, and without additional context regarding the specific theater's characteristics or the film's subsequent performance trajectory across its expanded Japanese release following the Osaka opening. This figure functions best as a data point illustrating the deliberately cautious, incrementally staged nature of the Japanese distribution strategy rather than as a definitive verdict on the film's overall reception within that specific market. It is worth reflecting on the layered cultural irony embedded in this release pattern, a film substantially built around a globally circulating, heavily mythologized version of ninja culture, drawing explicitly on decades of American genre cinema's own particular stylization of ninja mythology, as discussed extensively in relation to Sho Kosugi's casting and the broader genre lineage the production consciously invoked, arriving in Japan itself, the culture from which this mythology originally derives, only after a substantial delay and through an unusually cautious, narrowly staged theatrical rollout. This pattern suggests that whatever confidence the production and its American distributors held regarding the film's appeal to international and specifically Asian audiences, that confidence did not necessarily extend to an assumption of automatic broad commercial success within Japan's own specific and highly developed domestic theatrical marketplace, a market with its own well-established preferences, genre conventions, and competitive theatrical landscape that a foreign-made, English language film built around a heavily Americanized version of native Japanese ninja mythology could not necessarily take for granted. The MTV Movie Awards and the ritual recognition of genre spectacle. Rain's recognition at the June 9, 2010 MTV Movie Awards, receiving the ceremony's Biggest Badass award specifically for his performance in Ninja Assassin, deserves consideration as a genuinely revealing coda to the film's overall reception history, one that illuminates a distinct and separate channel of cultural recognition operating according to criteria entirely different from either the professional critical consensus or the CinemaScore audience satisfaction metric already discussed. The MTV Movie Awards have historically operated as an awards ceremony explicitly organized around popular, audience-voted recognition of genre and blockbuster filmmaking, deliberately eschewing the more traditionally prestige-oriented criteria that govern awards bodies focused on dramatic and narrative achievement, in favor of categories built specifically to celebrate exactly the kind of visceral, spectacle-driven, larger-than-life qualities that a film like Ninja Assassin was engineered from its inception to deliver. The specific category title, Biggest Badass, is itself worth dwelling on as a piece of evocative, deliberately informal award naming that stands in sharp contrast to the more solemn categorical language of traditional film awards bodies, Best Actor or Best Supporting Performance, in favor of a category constructed explicitly around the specific quality of charismatic, larger-than-life toughness and physical intimidation that a performer like Rain, cast and marketed specifically for his physical combat capabilities and disciplined screen presence, was uniquely positioned to embody. That Rain received this recognition specifically for his work in Ninja Assassin, a film whose professional critical reception had been overwhelmingly negative across virtually every major outlet surveyed, illustrates with particular clarity how thoroughly the criteria governing this specific category of popular, audience-oriented award recognition diverge from the criteria governing traditional professional film criticism. Rain's Raizo, precisely because of the qualities discussed extensively in relation to the character's construction, minimal dialogue, maximal physical precision, a performance built almost entirely around disciplined bodily control and controlled explosive violence, represented an almost ideal embodiment of exactly the specific quality the biggest badass category was designed to celebrate, regardless of whatever reservations professional critics held regarding the film's broader narrative, coherence or dramatic achievement. This award, then, functions as a kind of final, clarifying data point in understanding Ninja Assassin's overall critical and cultural reception, a film that professional critics overwhelmingly rejected on the grounds of narrative incoherence and excessive, poorly integrated violence nonetheless succeeded thoroughly enough in delivering its intended genre pleasures, precisely those pleasures the professional critical establishment found most objectionable, that it generated genuine popular enthusiasm sufficient to earn its lead performer specific, dedicated recognition within an awards context explicitly organized around celebrating exactly those qualities. The distance between the Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic scores discussed at length here and Reign's MTV Movie Awards recognition maps almost perfectly onto the broader distance already identified between professional critical assessment and the CinemaScore audience satisfaction metric, confirming a consistent pattern across multiple independent measures of reception. Ninja Assassin was a film whose professional critical failure and popular genre audience success were not contradictory outcomes, requiring reconciliation but rather two entirely coherent and mutually consistent responses to a film that succeeded, by design, at delivering a very specific and narrowly targeted set of genre satisfactions that professional criticism, evaluating the film against a broader and more demanding set of standards, was always likely to find insufficient.